You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 330, recorded on Sunday, October 25th. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line again from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill. Glad to be here.
This week we're going to be talking about the Little Steel Strike and Memorial Day Massacre of 1937. We obviously should have tied this more closely to Memorial Day, probably for thematic reasons, but it took us a while in our calendar of things to get around to this. And it is important as one of the last major violent clashes in the labor movement with police, but we think that it has some important lessons for present day, and so we wanted to talk about it since it's also one that, while it was pretty important at the time, I feel like has faded a little bit in the cultural memory compared to some of the other things that we've actually talked about a bunch of those other incidents on the show, but this is one that was pretty important at the time in 1937. So just let's summarize first what actually happened. So Republic Steel in May 1937 provoked a 7-state strike from 78,000 steelworkers trying to organize a union as part of a nationwide interracial and interethnic effort by the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, SWOC, of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, which had been formed in 1935. And this effort was to unionize steel plants or shut them down. This was about 5 years before the CIO officially launched the United Steelworkers. The national campaign, financed by the United Mine Workers, whose coal is used for steel production, had already won a union at U.S. Steel, the successor of Carnegie Steel that had so famously been murderously anti-union, as we talked about in previous episodes on the Homestead Strike and on the Pinkertons. But Republic Steel, as we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later in the episode, was unwilling to yield and was leading a coalition of right-wing anti-New Deal interests under the nickname Little Steel, hence the name the Little Steel Strike, because there were 6 steel companies in this coalition of anti-New Deal interests, and although they were large companies, they were small relative to the size of U.S. Steel. Republic funded Chicago police details with extra equipment and had them shoot unprovoked into and then severely beat and tear gas the crowd and of strikers and their families and other labor protesters who were present in solidarity. There are varying estimates on the number of people present, from several hundred to 2,500, and on how many people were injured, but certainly 10 people died. There's also some disagreement on the number of police officers present, but it was a much smaller number. The massacre took place in a field outside the plant, and many people had brought picnicking supplies, partly because it was Memorial Day. The crowd had been joyful before the massacre. Paramount Pictures had been at the field filming a newsreel and tried to hide it because it showed what had actually happened, and they claimed they were afraid it would provoke riots. Newspaper and wire service still photographs were used by the national press to imply that the police were simply defending themselves from violent rioting strikers. Despite a Senate investigation, the national strike fell apart because of how severely violent the crackdown had been at Republic Steel and their allied firms in other locations. So that's the overview summary of what happened. And now we wanted to talk about some specific themes that emerged before, during, and after the incident. So I guess, Rachel, we'll start by talking about how the Little Steel Strike came about with these companies deciding to take a stand against the union and try to fight them off, mainly because they wanted to take down the New Deal. So where should we start on that?
So let's start with Tom Girdler, who is the chairman of the board of Republic Steel. He absolutely refused to negotiate with the CIO in their efforts. He viewed them as nothing more than, quote, communists and racketeers. So Republic was the head of this coalition of corporations, industry groups, and wealthy people who were intent on destroying the CIO. And this comes from a Jacobin magazine article about this Memorial Day Massacre. So the broader aim of this coalition, which included key members, among its key members, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, and a semi-fascist organization called the American Liberty League. They were bent on undoing the entire New Deal. So this required defeating the CIO, which had emerged as an increasingly powerful ally of the Roosevelt administration. This also required undermining the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act. This statute was a centerpiece of the New Deal. It protected the right to strike and to engage in collective bargaining, and it actually gave legal license to the CIO's campaign. So this coalition, known collectively as Little Steel, they unleashed a counteroffensive. So they fired, threatened, assaulted hundreds of union supporters, and they absolutely refused to bargain with the union, which was all illegal according to this new Wagner Act. But Little Steel's aim was to nullify the Wagner Act. So this provoked a strike which began on May 26th and quickly grew to include 70,000 workers at 30 steel plants spread across the industrial heartland. So these strikers demanded that the companies respect their rights under the Wagner Act, which included the right to picket. So the Little Steel companies were eventually held liable under the Wagner Act for assaulting and threatening workers and for firing organizers and supporters and refusing to rehire the strikers when the walkout ended. But ironically, by losing in court, they discovered how little they needed to have worried about the Wagner Act in the first place. The penalties they faced were strictly civil ones and didn't actually amount to much. Republic, which ended up paying out the most, had to pay 3,000 workers several $100s each on average for holding them out of work for a year. And they didn't get paid for 5 years, by which time Republic was actually receiving war-related orders, so they were actually rolling in cash. At least 3,000 other workers who were illegally put out of work for a year got nothing. And I think this really reflects labor disputes today. You just kind of hear about slaps on the wrist, civil fines that really don't amount to much as a percentage of the profits of these companies, and they definitely don't amount to close to what workers lose out on in being illegally put out of work.
Yeah, it's just considered to be the cost of doing business. And in this case, part of the cost of doing business was to arm the police. They supplied and this is something we talked a little bit about in our episode talking about the Pinkertons in Chicago and some of the other things around the Haymarket affair that we've done episodes on, and how the rich industrialists in Chicago just basically treated the Chicago PD as their personal police force, and if the city didn't give them the latest technologies and armaments and so forth, they would just go ahead and do that as well. So Girdler, again, the chairman of the board of Republic Steel, he supplied the Chicago police with the extra armaments, with the extra weaponry, with the guns, the tear gas, all of that stuff. And as a result of this, you have those 10 workers get killed, 30 at least wounded by either gunshots or blows from truncheons, according to the laborpress.org article on this. A lot of people crippled for life. I mean, these were very, very severe injuries. And again, a lot of these people, they had brought women, they had brought children, they were there at a picnic and have a good time. We know from many different accounts and photographs that before there was any sort of incident, everything was totally fine and everyone was having a good time. And then suddenly the police just started shooting people and then absolutely clobbering them and stuff. And there were like doctors at the hospital talking about like people had holes in their head and stuff like that. It was just absolutely horrifying stuff that was happening. And there was, it said, the Senate investigation under Robert La Follette subsequently found that the Republic Steel Corporation has a uniformed police force of nearly 400 men, meaning the Chicago PD, whom it has equipped not only with revolvers, rifles, and shotguns, but also with more tear and sickening gas and gas equipment than has been purchased by any law enforcement body, local, state, or federal in the country. It has loosed its guards, thus armed to shoot down the citizens on the streets and highways. And remember, this is the biggest incident that happened, but there were strikes happening, again, with 78,000 workers in 7 states in this coalition, against this coalition of Little Steel. So there were a whole bunch of different violent incidents that were happening across the country, and basically they did succeed in breaking this strike. And it, as the Jacobin article says, in understanding where American workers are today, we must not forget the kind of violence inflicted upon them that Memorial Day 80 years ago, end quote, meaning essentially that yes, you can say that the unions are a lot less militant now than they used to be, and there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons that should be acknowledged is that there was pretty significant and horrifying violence perpetrated against them in this act, and as we're about to talk about, this was very well publicized violence at the time, and it's still, seemed to have no real effect, as we talked about, in terms of the penalties that were eventually handed down against these companies. So again, as we talked about, this was part of an effort from the capitalist class to oppose the entire New Deal. It was not just, oh, we don't want a union at our company or these other companies. It was, we're going to try to take a stand here and now to defeat and roll back the New Deal. And it was sort of these smaller level but still significant major corporations and entities like the Chamber of Commerce and so forth and the National Association of Manufacturers that were united in this cause, when some of the bigger industrialists like the folks at U.S. Steel were willing to play ball at least some of the time with the administration and with the steelworkers organizing committee. That was not the case, again, for the little steel consortium or coalition, and this was reflected in the level of preparation that they had undertaken ahead of this strike. And in fact, they were the ones who triggered the strike. They picked the timing that they believed they would be the most prepared for and forced the workers to go out earlier on strike than they had originally been planning to, therefore catching them off balance and so on. And this strategy worked very effectively for them. But it was part of a much larger strategy, and that theme around the media relations aspect was covered in an article headlined "Reframing Chicago's Memorial Day Massacre of May 30th, 1937" by Carol Quirk in American Quarterly, Volume 60, Number 1, March 2008, which I got off of JSTOR. So let's talk about Carol Quirk's research into the media coverage, media manipulation, and the famous newsreel footage that we're about to talk about, which we alluded to at the beginning of the episode. So she notes, in large part, the massacre's contemporaries and its historians have treated newsreel footage and news photographs as indisputable evidence, transcriptions of reality. However, archival materials, along with captioned news photographs that appeared in the national press and metropolitan dailies, and 3 Paramount newsreels, distinct newsreels that previously had gone unnoticed, reveal an untold story. In the weeks after the massacre, Chicago newspapers printed the same iconic photographs, and Paramount News edited the same newsreel footage, and in both instances purported to show that the strikers were a, quote, riotous mob as a representation justifying police action. So her article makes an important point here, which is that there was initially, because there were 2 waves of coverage on this. There was the first wave that presented this as this riot that had to be quelled by the brave police officers, and then there was a second wave of coverage after the La Follette investigation when it turned out that had all been BS. And her point in this research was that in many cases, they didn't even selectively edit things. They just selectively presented the same information. And there were cases in her report where they would show horrifyingly violent photographs that were shown in the newspaper of people being severely beaten, in some cases being beaten to death. And they would just write a caption under it that implied that the police officers were defending themselves from an attack by these mobbed up rioters or whatever. No evidence to support that, and they didn't show anything before that to indicate that there had been an attack, because there wasn't an attack. But they just presented these horrifying scenes of police brutality against men, women, and children, and said like, ta-da! This proves the official narrative that was coming from the public relations firm that had been hired by the steel company ahead of time. So this was all pretty much pre-planned. Maybe not exact specifics of it, but they already had a media strategy ready to go and were willing to use pretty excessive force. So Republic Steel CEO Thomas Girdler had hired the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton, and he advocated the National Association of Manufacturers sponsored Mohawk Valley Plan, in which corporations labeled union leaders outside agitators with a small following, a back-to-work campaign instigated by local employees and supported by the company, often then led to violence, which further demoralized unionists. Publicizing such violence also branded organized labor a threat to law and order, tarnishing it in the public eye. Girdler published Girdler brandished brutal force when the velvet glove of public opinion failed, firing workers and purchasing 26 times more tear gas and munitions than the city of Chicago had in 1 year. Now, in this analysis, she found that there are just 168 frames of unedited newsreel footage of the actual shooting to look at. The newsreel included what happened before and what happened after, but the cameraman was changing a lens when the shooting started, and the shooting lasted for just 14 seconds, of which he captured only 7. So partly because the beginning of the actual shooting was not caught on this newsreel footage, they were able to just imply in that absence of visual information that the police had been provoked, and it's just, sorry, we didn't catch it. The crowd, however, was filled with women, many wearing brightly patterned clothing. Even on the black and white, you could see that, which made the footage so inflammatory when it finally came to light. Again, that was why Paramount News knew what they were doing when they said initially that they didn't want to release this because they figured that it was going to provoke riots. And there was a great deal of unrest when it was finally released, although it was still selectively edited after the Senate committee. And even the official Senate committee version, which was probably the most horrifying version, was never released publicly in theaters. One woman who survived but had been injured or wounded in the front line was 5 months pregnant. She was a member of the CIO's Women's Auxiliary. Lupe Marshall, a woman social worker who worked with Mexican steelworkers and had come out to support them, was also on the front line wearing a suit, and she is visible in the footage and survived the attack to testify to Congress on the shock and confusion of the marchers when the shooting began because it had come out of nowhere without warning. And she was 4'11" and 97 pounds and was beaten severely while trying to stop police from beating people already on the ground. She accompanied many of the severely beaten men to the hospital in a paddy wagon, and some of them died on the way from their injuries. The incident also, it's important to understand, took place just 2 years after the Associated Press had figured out how to transmit photographs by wire, and their still images were what accompanied the initial newspaper stories and formed the public's and even the White House's initial understanding of events. The PR machine working for Republic Steel made sure that their previously prepared spin was the official story about what happened here. Newspaper accounts even explicitly cited the photographs as proof that the police were defending themselves, often, as I said earlier, with the captions literally contradicting what was visible in the images. And Paramount's initial release of their newsreel matched that narrative as well. However, unfortunately for the PR machine, and this is something that one of the authors in one of the other articles noted is similar to today's discussion around smartphone videos capturing, all the police violence that we see today and the various things leading to Black Lives Matter protests when someone is killed by the police. And of course, you could also make comparisons to the Rodney King incident and the way that the filming of that changed the sort of public perception, contrary to the initial report. The PR machine in the newspapers had not counted on many of the marchers also carrying personal still cameras. Chicago liberals and the strike organizers quickly realized that they could craft a counter-narrative about what really happened by showing photos within the crowd, proving that it had been happy and peaceful. Moreover, Paul Anderson of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who is the guy who broke this story wide open eventually, decided to actually do real interviews with the participants the day after, and he got a leaked copy of the unedited Paramount footage, which he turned over to the La Follette Committee at the U.S. Senate, which we previously talked about that committee in the context of exposing how the Pinkertons had completely infiltrated the labor movement and many unions to significant levels of power. Anderson's print account drew a poetic and tragic narrative from the raw newsreel footage, highlighting the patriotism and religiosity and happiness, then despair, of the protesters. He used phrases like, quote, brains literally had been beaten out, which is true. He also countered the PR firm's intentional narratives that the strikers were, quote, cowards who ran away by showing photos from behind the police lines facing the crowd with its back turned running away and yet still being attacked by the police. This made the police look like the cowardly ones. But again, I think it's remarkable that the initial wave of reports would show people attempting to flee the police and being batoned or shot by the police, and then the captions would imply, oh, and then the cowardly strikers, they were trying to rile up everybody, and then they ran away at the first sign of trouble. And most normal people would look at that and say, hey, why are you beating people who are running away? You're attacking them from behind their back. That's cowardly. And that was the tack that Anderson took, and that helped to start shift the narrative on things, but that was not how it was initially reported in papers all over the country. He also said that the police were, quote, appallingly businesslike, and, quote, grimly methodical, as if they were killing snakes, end quote. The La Follette Senate investigation hearings and their own edit of the newsreel, which they did all kinds of things to do it in slow motion or freeze frames and things like that, which was, that was technically challenging, I think, for the time period, or at least technically impressive to pull something off like that. This was so dramatic, this investigation hearings were so dramatic that newspapers across the country had to release this second wave with new versions of the story of what had happened, and that rapidly shifted public opinion in favor of the demonstrators. But again, the strike fell apart because of how brutally violent this was, and that the initial public reaction had not been on their side, despite the fact that they were the victims of this. So that is the story of the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 as part of the Little Steel Strike, and the theme of public relations, spin doctoring, and so forth being an important thing. Rachel, I'll go back to you now, as there's definitely some other things that we haven't necessarily covered here that you might want to talk about, but I also wanted to get your thoughts on this PR angle of it.
Well, we kind of joked before recording that if there's a labor dispute happening, always look to the New York Times to see what the exact wrong angle is. And this was no exception. I think the New York Times also really fed into that rioting mob narrative that portrayed these strikers as an angry mob who just weren't reasonable, and also it even led FDR to kind of go against this initially. I think he said something about like the public sentiment is a plague on both your houses. So kind of a real like team nobody.
Both sidesing it.
Yeah, both sidesing it, team nobody. Yeah. So I think it's really important to look at like how media portrays these labor disputes, and also talking about how the Senate committee actually had to edit the footage, because I'm not sure if you said this exactly, but like the footage was so fast at real speed, like you couldn't really, it was so hard to capture what was happening. So you really had to physically slow down the speed, the film speed. And I think that's something that we really see today. Like there has to be like actual freeze frames or like slowed down footage, just because so much is happening that you can't actually process what is occurring unless you do edit the footage somehow. So I think it shows just how these situations can just kind of turn on a dime. Like you see these happy singing, picnicking strikers, and then all of a sudden all heck is breaking loose and you see shots fired. Well, I think actually like in some of the frames, like it was almost impossible to catch the shots being fired just because it was happening so quickly. I think there were just like disembodied hands with smoking guns, but you didn't actually see like who was firing or at whom they were firing. So it's just like chaotic, which I think you definitely see today on like cell phone footage of protests and footage of police brutality towards protesters.
Another feature that is discussed in the article analyzing the newsreel footage and some of the other photographs is how just overwhelmingly smug so many of the police officers are. There are moments where you can see some of them hesitate before just completely trying to crack someone's skull open, and then they go ahead and do it anyway. And then generally they would even turn directly into the camera because they knew that there were media people there, and they would just grin like this was the funniest thing in the world. And it's just horrifying stuff. And again, I think a lot of resonant themes for today. All right, Rachel, that's going to be all our time for today. And as usual, the arsenalfordemocracy.com website with each episode has the PDF that has the notes and all the sources that we've talked about today on our episode. That's true every week. And there's a lot of stuff that we put in the notes that we didn't have a chance for time reasons to cover today. But Rachel, thank you so much for being on this week to talk about this important and sort of partly forgotten strike.
Thanks for having me.